We are back on Morning Line. Thanks for joining us. We're talking about memory loss, Alzheimer's, and some of the treatments and study that's going on right now to try to get to the bottom of this in terms of not just cures, but maybe prevention and the like. Dr. Paul Newhouse over at Vanderbilt, he's the director of the Center for Cognitive Medicine there, is at the forefront of this. It's a pleasure to have you. It really is neat that we live in a town like Nashville with people, such experts like you, Dr. Schaffner with infectious diseases, but people like you that are here really at the forefront of it to answer our questions. Appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure.
Take some more calls. We have a caller on line 1. Caller, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Yes, hi, Dr. Newhouse. Nice to chat with you. Thank you for talking about this subject. My father passed away 4 years ago from Alzheimer's, and I heard you mention congestive heart stuff and all that, which he had congestive heart failure and was also a diabetic. What my question is, though, is I know, our beloved Pat Summitt passed away from this early onset Alzheimer's, and I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. I'd like to know if they know kind of what brings that on, and who is eligible to get tested for something like that, considering how young she was. And I'll let y'all talk, and thank you so much.
Thank you for your call. I'm glad she brought that up, because Pat Summitt, wonderful woman, brought so much attention to this.
But
the early onset especially. What is early onset Alzheimer's? I forget how old Pat was when she was diagnosed. It was in her 50s, I guess, right?
Late 50s,
Late 50s.
Or early 60s, yeah.
Okay.
So we would consider Pat to be an early onset patient with Alzheimer's disease.
Okay.
And we do see a certain percent of patients who develop this disease or develop the onset of symptoms, at least, in their 50s and 60s. We were talking earlier about MCI. They may start to have a little bit of memory loss, but it doesn't really cross over to dementia until they get a little bit older. But if you look back, with a retrospectoscope, you can often ask families to say, well, they saw a little bit of memory loss maybe 10 years ago, but they kind of pushed it away or didn't pay attention to it. We don't exactly know in most cases why one person gets their illness in their 50s and 60s versus 70s or 80s. Well, we're not sure. Okay. It certainly is the case that if you have this risk factor gene, this common risk factor gene, you may tend to have earlier onset of illness, but not necessarily that early. And so we're not entirely clear that we understand all the risk factors for this early variant of this illness. But the case is that, so we don't really have a perfect test for it yet, unless there's a strong family history where multiple people in a family have Alzheimer's disease at early age. Then we would test them for one of those really rare genes that causes familial Alzheimer's. Yeah. But those are pretty rare. I mean, we can count on the fingers of a few hands how many families in the United States have that. So that's not a common problem at all. But for most of us that have early onset disease, we really have to focus on kind of 10 to even 20 years earlier. And so prevention efforts are really focusing on people who are not already ill.
Okay.
And we want to be able to track those people. And one of the ways we're doing that is something called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, or ADNI, ADNI. And that's a national study that we're participating in here at Vanderbilt, where we actually take people like yourself and image their brain repeatedly over many years to see if we can detect when does the earliest change occur.
Okay, great.
And we can actually map those abnormal proteins now just with a brain scan. So we can actually see the protein deposition in the brain with a specialized kind of PET scan.
Are these the same type of proteins we've heard about that accumulate in the heads of football players with CTE?
Similar.
CTE is different than Alzheimer's, is it not? To me, and check me if I'm wrong, to me, CTE just seems like the very worst thing I can even imagine. Alzheimer's is pretty darn bad, okay? But yeah, eventually you're going to lose all your memory, and yeah, it's horrible. Don't get me wrong. But CTE, it's like, it just, seems like your brain just, it's not necessarily just memory, it just isn't functioning right. And you know it's not, and it's driving you crazy because it's like a machine that won't work. And I can totally understand why some of these sufferers have committed suicide when they were completely lucid but could no longer live with the brain malfunctioning the way it was inside their skull.
So with CTE, we have one of the abnormal proteins that you see in Alzheimer's, but not both.
Okay.
So it's what we call a tau disease, not an amyloid plus tau, which are the two abnormal proteins that go together. So, and the tau, the abnormal tau protein seems to occur in a different distribution, but it seems to be related to the trauma. So in the autopsies that Ann McKee has done in Boston, and she visited us here at Vanderbilt a couple of years ago, what she shows is that you can see this tau protein in the brain, but it's a very different pattern than in Alzheimer's.
Okay.
So we think the causes are a little bit different, but I agree with you that head injury is now a huge issue for us to cope with.
Yeah, the study recently, I think with her, it was on the evening news the other day. It's not just athletes, it's soldiers coming back now because of the concussive injuries from explosions.
And it turns out that, the human brain was not designed to be banged around constantly.
You think?
And so it's not surprising that we're beginning to see the long-term effects of this.
Gotcha. Let's go next to Teresa. Hello, Teresa.
Oh, hello.
Hi, how can we help you?
Well, I caught part of your program this morning, and thank you for having Dr. Newhouse on the show. My mother and her mother previously suffered from Alzheimer's, and so I'm very interested in the subject, and have done some research on my own. I'm so glad to hear about more research that Vanderbilt is doing. And I wondered if you all had talked in the discussion about some of the newest findings that say that Alzheimer's disease is a vascular neuropathy. And I had read from the Journal of Progress in Neurology and Neurosciences recent article, and am very interested in the connection of atherosclerosis and the buildup of plaque as being the contributing factor. If you discussed that, I don't know if I heard it or not, but I'd be glad to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. We haven't gone into too much detail. That's a good question.
So we know that blood vessel vascular problems, as the caller said, are an added burden, right? So if you have mini strokes, if you have blood vessels that are clogged or thickened, or the heart is not pumping adequately, that can definitely add to the burden that the brain has. And so one of the things we notice is that if you have a little bit of Alzheimer's pathology in the brain, but then you also have blood vessel damage, that simply makes you more likely to be demented. And so we think that they're not necessarily directly connected, but they add to each other. And so if you think of this as a kind of overlapping circles, if you add blood vessel problems to amyloid or tau problems, you get worse disease. So absolutely it can play a role.
That makes perfect sense. Now, as you said, one of the substances you're looking at is nicotine.
That's right.
Now, we have no doubt at all that cigarette smoking is bad for you.
Correct.
But in a twisted way, do cigarette smokers get a benefit from the nicotine?
So this has been controversial.
Yeah, I imagine so.
Actually, the best evidence is in Parkinson's disease, that smokers are actually less likely to develop Parkinson's disease. We don't fully understand why, but we think that nicotine may have some protective effects on certain nerve cells. It doesn't seem as clear-cut for Alzheimer's disease, but we think that, many of our drugs come from plants, right? And nicotine is a natural substance. It's actually found in tobacco, but of course, actually it's found in other plants, like tomatoes have nicotine in them, and other vegetables, it turns out, that are other plants. And so nicotine, because many of our plants develop things we can use as medicines, we decided to investigate because nicotine acts in the brain. It stimulates nerve cells in a very specific way. There are receptors for nicotine in the brain, just like with opiates, right? Like the poppy seed has receptors in the brain. We thought, well, let's look at the ability of nicotine to enhance attention and memory. And that actually has a pretty good track record. And so we decided many years ago to do a study in MCI to see if we could improve memory, and it worked.
See, that's interesting to keep following that. Certainly the delivery system for nicotine in your subjects, I would imagine, is not smoking.
No,
there are
exactly.
patches, there are gums, there are tablets.
We use patches actually,
okay,
and which is a very smooth way of delivering this. And we're actually exploring the potential for nicotinic treatment even beyond MCI. And in fact, the pharmaceutical companies have been very interested in this strategy.
What kind of things?
Well, we've looked at everything from depression, late life depression, to even post-chemotherapy induced brain fog.
Like nicotine's addicting, isn't it?
Not by itself.
It's not by itself, only in a cigarette.
So it turns out, well, think of it this way, Nick. You could walk into Walmart today and buy a pack of nicotine patches.
Nicorette or,
I mean, you don't need a prescription.
Oh, I didn't know that.
I mean, I always tell reporters, I said, you don't see kids trading nicotine patches on the playground, right? It's not a substance that people want to take usually.
You don't really get a...
You don't get a buzz from it. You don't get any...
Then why do they put nicotine in cigarettes?
Well, they don't. It's there naturally.
Is it all naturally?
It's there naturally. Now, it is true that people will not smoke without nicotine in them. So nicotine has properties that enhance smoking.
Okay.
But the reality is, if you separate nicotine from the cigarette, nobody wants to take it.
Interesting. Well, take a break on that note. When we come back, more of your phone calls in our final segment right after this.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay.
So that...